Welcome. We are going to start on a classic. I say classic because this book came out when I was in the 4th grade. And I am no longer in the 4th grade. I am now a teacher. So this book has been around for well over 20 years. It is the first of 7, the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, written by JK Rowling. But this version was illustrated by Jim Kay, which means that he drew images throughout it. And one of the reasons that I'm sharing this is for the older students because it is a lot. I'm certainly not going to be reading the whole thing in one sitting. That would take hours. But I'd like to read to you some chapters, and as we go, we will see how many we get through and if people want me to finish it off. One of the great things about stories like this is if you were working on an art project or something else where you could listen to a book, or perhaps as you are organizing something like I need to organize my laundry room, you can listen to this while you do that. All right, we are going to be getting started with chapter 1, which is titled The Boy Who Lived. We are also, as my beautiful, lovely students, going to ignore Miss Cozier's nails. She'll fix them tomorrow. So chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people that you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Miss Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over the garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursley had a small son named Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they ever wanted, but they also had a secret. Their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think that they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended that she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it could possibly be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never, ever seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They did not want Dudley mixing up with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up in the dull gray Tuesday of our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that a strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Miss Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed the large tawny owl that fluttered past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Oh, little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive. but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said, Privet Drive. No. Looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills, and he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear the people that dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and he was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on. And a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived at Grunning's car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley also always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them have never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important telephone calls, and he shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgotten all about the people in the cloaks until he passed by a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as they passed. He didn't know why, but it made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. He was on his way back past them, clutching the large donut in the bag, and he caught a few words that they were saying. The Potters. That's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. So Mr. Dursley currently thinks that all these people in strange cloaks, which are like long jackets, look awfully strange right now, and he's thinking they must be collecting money for some type of profit or event. And they are not. They're whispering about the Potters. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him. He seized his telephone and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who also had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He had never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Miss Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. If he had a sister like that, all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem upset at all at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who is gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mrs. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought that he had been called a muggle, whatever that was, and he was rattled. He hurried his way to the car and set off home, hoping he wasn't imagining things which had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learnt a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. "And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern." The newsreader allowed himself a grin. "Most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?" "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps the people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week. But I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters? Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he expected, Miss Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended that she didn't have a sister. "No," she said sharply. "Why?" "Oh, funny stuff on the news," Mr. Dursley mumbled. "Owls, shooting stars. There were a lot of funny people around the town today." "So?" snapped Mrs. Dursley. "Well, I just thought maybe, it was something to do with, her lot." Miss Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her that he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said as casually as he could, "Their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," Miss Dursley said stiffly. "What was his name again? Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all of this have anything to do with the Potters? And if it did, it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he couldn't even bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see her, and Petunia couldn't get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect him. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly in the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car slammed in the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared in the corner, and the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently that you would have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man has ever been seen in Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, very old, and judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt, he was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which he swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind the half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak looking for something, but he didn't seem to realize that he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. And for some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "Huh, I should have known." He had found what he was looking for inside of his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up into the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into the darkness. 12 times he clicked out the put-outer, until the only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks off in the distance, which the eyes of the cat were watching him. If anyone looked out their window right now, even the beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to make out anything that was happening down on the pavement. So he flicked off all of the lights with his magic cigarette lighter that was a put-outer. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back into his cloak, and he set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. It didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly. You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting all day on a brick wall, said Professor McGonagall. All day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here. Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. Oh yes, everybody's celebrating all right, she said impatiently. You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something is going on. It was on their news. She jerked her head back to the Dursleys in the dark living room. I heard it. Flock of owls shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I bet that was Daedalus Diggle. He's never had much sense. You can't blame them, said Dumbledore gently. We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. I know that, said Professor McGonagall irritably. But that's no reason to lose our heads. People have been downright careless, and on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors. She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. A fine thing it would have been if, on the very day that you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out about all of us. I suppose he really has gone. Dumbledore? It certainly seems so, said Dumbledore. We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a sherbet lemon? A what? A sherbet lemon. They're a kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of. No, thank you, said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think that this was a moment for sherbet lemons. As I say, even if you know who has gone, my dear Professor, surely any sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense for 11 years. I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort. Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking two sherbet lemons, seemed not to notice. It all gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I've never seen any reason to be frightened or of saying Voldemort's name. If I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring, but you're different. Everyone who knows you knows that you're the only one that you know. All right, Voldemort was frightened of. Well, you flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had powers I will never have. Only because you're too, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me that she liked my new earmuffs. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, The owls are nothing to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying? About why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him? It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached a point where she was most anxious to discuss the real reason that she had been sitting on the cold, hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another sherbet lemon and did not answer. What they were saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up at Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James? I can't believe it. I don't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. Well, that's not all. They're trying to say that he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. And no one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke. And that's why he's gone? Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true? Faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, after all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy? It's just astounding. All of the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose he's the one who told you I'd be here, by the way? Yes, said Professor McGonagall. And I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places? I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You don't mean, you can't mean the people who live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here? It's the best place for him, Dumbledore said firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when it's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting down back on the wall. Really, Dumbledore, you think that you can explain all of this in a letter? The people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all of that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the little boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Oh, Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying that his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as it looked up and down the streets as they looked for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorbike fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing compared to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be Aloud, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and a beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of dustbin lids, and his feet in the leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast, muscular arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. "Hagrid," said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. "At last. Now, where did you get the motorbike?" "Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir," said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorbike as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir." "No problems, were there?" "No, sir. The house was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol." Dumbledore and McGonagall bent over to the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy, fast asleep. Under the tuft of jet-black hair that was over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a bolt of lightning. Is that where, Professor McGonagall?" "Yes," said Dumbledore. "He'll have that scar forever." Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in useful. I have one myself above my left knee, which is a perfect map of the London Underground." "Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'll better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house. "Could I say goodbye to him, sir?" asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. And then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. "You'll wake the muggles." Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, staring at his large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. "But I can't stand it. Lily and James are dead, and poor Harry here is off to live with muggles." Yes, it's all very sad, but get a grip of yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found," Professor McGonagall whispered. McGonagall, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep. He took a letter out of his cloak and tucked it inside Harry's blanket, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood out and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling lights that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We have no business staying here. We might as well go and join the celebrations." "Yeah," said Hagrid in a muffled voice. "I best get this bike away. Good night, Professor McGonagall, Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself up on the motorbike and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took a look out on at the silver put-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back into their street lamps so that Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out the tabby cat slinking around the corner on the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he murmured. He turned on his heel, and with a swish of his cloak he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky, the very last place that you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him as he slept on, not knowing that he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken up in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know at this very moment the people in the secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." And that brings us to chapter 2, which I am going to start on another video. And for me, that'll be tomorrow. For you, you can choose another day, or you could possibly choose right now if the video is up. This has been a reading of the first chapter of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, written by JK Rowling, and this version is illustrated by Jim Kay.